Tonight's lecture is the inaugural Christine Mona Khademi lecture with Dr. Maryam Shanechi. Earlier this year, we announced that this new annual lecture has been made possible through a generous gift from Mona Khademi, Christine's father, who will be here soon. We are also pleased to have Christine's sisters and mother with us today. Christine graduated from Stanford with a B.S. in biology with honors in 2012 and aspired to be a doctor. She sadly left this world too soon. In her memory, this annual lecture will support and highlight the work of women in particular who are making substantial contributions to Iranian culture and society in the fields of politics, science, technology, public service, art, and culture. I really encourage you all to read the longer biography we have on the handout and learn more about this remarkable young woman. And we are also grateful to Mr. Khademi for his ongoing support of academic programming at Stanford Iranian Studies to promote peace and democracy in Iran and around the world. So we'll come back to Mr. Khademi when he arrives after the lecture. I'm going to get straight into introducing Dr. Maryam Shanechi. She is Dean's Professor in Electrical and Computer Engineering, Computer Science, and Biomedical Engineering at the University of Southern California. She is also founding director of the newly established USC Center for Neurotechnology. She really has an extensive and impressive biography, and I encourage you to read it on our website. I'm just going to highlight a few of her many accomplishments today. She received her bachelor's degree in engineering science from the University of Toronto, her master's and Ph.D. degrees in electrical engineering and computer science from MIT, and her postdoctoral training in neural engineering and neuroscience at Harvard Medical School and UC Berkeley. She is the recipient of several awards, including the National Institutes of Health Directors' New Innovator Award, National Science Foundation Career Award, and the Office of Naval Research Young Investigator Award. She is a fellow of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers and was named the 2023 Blavatnik National Awards Finalist. And really, this is only a part of the long list of awards and recognitions she's received. So I can't think of anyone better to be the inaugural Christine Mona Khademi speaker. So please join us in welcoming her.
My name is Monib Khademi, and I am Christine's father. Christine's mother, sisters, and brother-in-laws are also here, and we are really honored to be able to celebrate our daughter in this way. And we know that our daughter will be exemplified in these lectures and the projects that this endowment will fund. Christine was a brilliant young scholar with keen eyes for the unseen. She loved her fellow humans and had a lovely sense of humor. She was curious and mischievous-making in a very kind way. Christine spent some of the best times of her life, best moments of her life here at Stanford, including the last term, where people have done all the work and are ready to graduate, called Camp Stanford, and she essentially picked everything that she wanted to do that she hadn't done the first 3.5 years to do during that year. We are grateful for Stanford continuing to lead, innovate, and maintain a world-class research and educational institution in so many disciplines, and we are thrilled that it's in the Bay Area. I thank Hamida Muqaddam, a fellow MIT and GSB alum, as well as Christina Muqaddam for creating this program. And I'm grateful for the great teacher and friend, Dr. Abbas Milani, we've known each other for over 20 years, and he has created an incredible home for the Iranian culture, for all of us in diaspora, which is alive and thriving. Among many dimensions, including art, literature, history, and other areas, it also includes scientific achievement by those of Iranian descent. And in particular, we love that you're here, Dr. Shanechi, as the inaugural speaker of Christine's lectures. The web of relationships that Abbas has nurtured here, overseas, and in Iran is unique. Our family is happy to pass the baton in this way. We would like in a small way to inspire others to pursue similar dreams as Christine would have loved to do. I often say the spirit cares that there be flying, not who flies. This event would not have been possible without Roma Prahad's activities and care and courtesy with which you have created this whole program. Finally, Professor Shanechi, Maryam Shanechi, your father worked with my father in Iran, which is an amazing coincidence that happened. But as we often say in Farsi, del be del rah dare, I mean, our hearts in some ways are connected. We are thrilled that you're here for the inaugural lecture, and you are the perfect scholar to do this. So thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you very much.
So it's a pleasure to be here today and talk about some of our work. I'm especially grateful to the Khademi family for sponsoring this lecture series. I'm truly, truly honored to be the inaugural speaker for the lecture series. So with that, I would like to tell you a little bit about what we do in my lab, which is at the intersection of AI and neurotechnology towards treating various brain disorders. Now, as you may know, brain disorders are a leading cause of disability worldwide. There are over 900 million people worldwide who suffer from these disorders, including mental health conditions. And they're quite debilitating. But despite all this, actually, we are pretty bad at treating them. So in the case of major depression, for example, 20 to 30% of patients are resistant to any of our current therapies, whether medication or psychotherapy. That's 5 million people in the US alone. If you think about economic burden of disease, just for major depression in the US is over $200 billion annually, more than diabetes, more than cancer. So given this huge societal challenge, the question is, what can we do for these patients? Now, based on the understanding that these disorders are signs of abnormal electrical activity patterns across diverse brain networks, one idea could be to try to directly decode and then regulate these abnormal electrical activity patterns. And this, if it can be done, can be potentially revolutionizing these treatments. Now, there's actually been proof of concept demonstration showing that if we electrically stimulate an appropriate region of the brain with these biphasic electrical pulse trains, depression symptoms may be alleviated. So this, of course, is remarkable. But unfortunately, it does not happen in every patient. And therefore, what we have to do is to make these deep brain stimulation therapies more effective across a wider number of patients for these to actually become a form of therapy that we give them. So the question is, what do we do in order to improve efficacy? Now, if you think about how these systems work currently, what they do is they have a stimulation device, they turn it on at a fixed level, think about a fixed dose of electrical stimulation therapy that you're giving to the patient. So as an engineer, when I looked at this a few years back, the first thing that came into my mind was that just like when we try to, let's say, control an airplane, from a given altitude to a target altitude, we don't just turn the engine off and hope for the best. We actually get some sort of sensor measurement about the current altitude of the airplane, as well as a model of aerodynamics in order to decide how to adjust the engine thrust to get the airplane to a target level. That's how we control, for example, an airplane. So how can we possibly hope to regulate an abnormal brain state without having some sort of feedback of the brain activity that we are regulating, as well as a dynamic model of how the brain responds to stimulation? So this abnormal state, for example, could be an abnormal mood that we want to regulate. So we need some sort of feedback in terms of how we are affecting it. Now, this is what we call a closed-loop control system in engineering. because we essentially have a closed loop with some measurement from the system that we are trying to control. And as engineers, we are very good at designing these systems. Think about autopilots again. So you may ask me, so what's the big deal? Why can't we already do this for the brain? And the issue is, of course, that unlike an engineered system, we didn't design the brain. It's an immensely complex system of over 80 billion neurons with unknown dynamics. And that introduces a huge AI challenge to build data-driven models of this complex system and to come up with data collection frameworks that can enable this modeling. So you may ask me, okay, so what does this data look like? What do these signals look like? So what I'm showing you here are electrodes that are implanted on the surface of the brain. We call these electrocorticography or ECOG. And these are the signals that we record from them. So this is space and time. So one thing you would notice with these signals is that there are many of them. They're very complex. They're very noisy. There's no clear patterns in these signals that would, for example, tell me what a depressed patient's mood is at any given time. So modeling, decoding, and control of these signal patterns is really what is required to develop the first model-based control systems for regulation of abnormal brain states. And indeed, that is our vision. We work in my lab at the interface of AI, control theory, and neuroscience to develop these closed-loop decoding and control systems for the brain and enable a new generation of neurotechnologies for neurological and neuropsychiatric disorders, which hopefully will help tens of millions of patients. And that is really why I entered into this domain. I was a Ph.D. student in electrical engineering and computer science working on decoding wireless communication signals. When I read about the brain, and I was fascinated by its complexity, so I decided, why can't I use the same mathematical principles to decode the brain instead of decoding the wireless signals? So that's how it started, and I continued my career at this interface of AI and neurotechnology. All right. So how do we envision this closed-loop control system that I'm talking about? We envision a system that would take brain activity, decode from that an underlying mental state, let's say mood in depression, use that as feedback within a controller that would then adjust the therapy. In this case, the amplitude and frequency of these biphasic pulse trains in order to take the symptom states to a healthy level. Now, this is our closed-loop control system. And this system, as I have depicted here, is unrealized to date. And there are multiple computational challenges we have to overcome to realize this system. The first challenge, of course, is how do we take brain signals and from that decode what somebody's mood is over time? That's the first challenge. This is actually quite difficult, and when we started working on this problem, had not been done before. So we said, okay, let's first start by collecting the right data sets to solve this problem. In collaboration with Eddie Chang, who's a neurosurgeon at UCSF, we recorded intracranial brain activity from epilepsy patients across a network of brain regions over 1 to 2 weeks. And the reason we do this in epilepsy patients is not because we're interested in epilepsy, but rather because these patients happen to have these electrodes already implanted for their standard clinical monitoring. So we can actually use those recordings to study these questions. So these patients are in the hospital for 1 to 2 weeks where they're getting these recordings. So during that time, we actually ask them a couple times a day to report their mood using an iPad-based questionnaire. For example, here, there are 20 questions, let's say 22 questions. In this question, I ask them, on a scale of depressed to happy, tell me how you feel at this moment in time. So we ask them these questions to give us an aggregate measure of their mood as related to depression and anxiety. So maybe we have a couple of mood labels a day, and this is the data set by which we have to train these decoders. Now, for those who may be familiar with machine learning, you know this is a tough problem to solve because you have a very high-dimensional neural signal space that you need to model, but you have very sparse labels of mood by which to model it. So we showed back in 2018 that we can actually solve this problem and achieve the decoding of mood from human intracranial brain activity. And the way we did this was by developing a technique that is called dimensionality reduction in this case. So what was the idea? The idea was, okay, if the state is represented across a network of brain regions, why don't we try to find the smallest possible subnetwork that is good enough for decoding instead of trying to model everything, which is almost impossible. So we developed a method that identified these smaller subnetworks. And then even within these smaller subnetworks, we further reduced the dimensionality of these complex signals that I showed you, meaning we summarize them into a few state variables that we call latent states. So we reduce dimensionality in the sense of describing a lot of signals in terms of a few random variables. And then we just relate those to our sparse mood labels to enable generalizable modeling. So did this work? We tested this in 7 patients, and what we found was that indeed we could track their mood variation just based on their brain activity. So I'm showing you decoded mood versus measured mood. So the closer you are to this line, the better. And you can see that in each patient with a significant level, we could actually track their mood variations. So this was exciting because it opens the door to actual objective tracking of symptom states over time such that we can personalize and adjust our therapies. So this was great. But then the question was, what were these subnetworks? Am I supposed to take questions now?
Sorry, questions will be at the end.
Okay. What were the subnetworks that were important for mood decoding? So we found that our decoder across all of the patients picked consistent limbic regions for its decoding. So these were some of the regions that were picked. But more interestingly than that, in 60% of our individual, this region of the brain that we call orbitofrontal cortex was found as the most mood predictive region. So why is this interesting? Because in an independent study in collaboration with Eddie, we went ahead and stimulated in orbitofrontal cortex. And what we found was that depression symptoms were actually alleviated. So patients went from describing their feelings to be on the sad side or a little bit nervous to describing it as being calm, cool, and collected, and feeling a lot better. So these 2 different studies, one based on AI machine learning, one based on simulation, converged at this common node, orbitofrontal cortex, and showed its significance in the emotion regulation network. All right, so that's how, briefly, we are addressing the first challenge. But unfortunately, that's not enough. Because even if I can decode somebody's depressed mood perfectly, I still don't know how to stimulate their brain to regulate and change that depressed symptom. So what we need additionally are input-output models that would describe the effect of stimulation on brain activity and therefore on the underlying states, essentially a model of this box. So in a recent study, we also started to tackle this problem. To do this, we now incorporated the effect of stimulation as an input into our models. And then the question was, how do we collect data to fit the model? So think about it. You want to collect data, you have to stimulate the brain somehow, record the response, and try to relate the 2 together. But the question was, how do we stimulate the brain in a manner that, number 1, is safe, and number 2, gives us informative data sets? So to do this, we developed novel electrical stimulation patterns that start again with this biphasic pulse, because we know this is safe. This has been used in the clinic extensively, it's charge balanced. But instead of giving it with a fixed frequency and amplitude, we stochastically randomly change its frequency and amplitude according to a coin flip between 2 levels. Now, we show that doing this actually gives you stimulation patterns that can excite the brain activity across the spectrum to give you informative data. So having shown its safety, we went ahead and applied it in the brain in animal models. And what we found was that indeed fitting our models could predict how neural activity changes in response to a changing stimulation. So essentially the gray and the orange track each other. So this is how we are starting to tackle the second input-output modeling challenge. So now that we have these two components, of course, we have to put them together to come up with a regulation strategy. So I'm going to give you some intuition in terms of how we think about this problem. So the idea is that if you have an input-output model, you know how stimulation is going to change brain activity. Now, if you have a decoder, you know how that change in brain activity would change somebody's mood. So together, you can describe the effect of your therapy stimulation on mood through neural activity and therefore build a feedback controller. So we've actually done some pilot studies in which in real time, we decode somebody's mood variations. And then when the mood drops below a threshold, meaning we detect some depressed mood, we stimulate the brain. And we've shown that even in real time and closed loop, we can actually decode somebody's mood variation in order to guide therapy. And this is a direction we're extensively currently working on. Okay. So what I've done so far, and what my goal was, is to just kind of walk you through this entire loop, describe the challenges, the components needed, and some of the progress. But of course, there's so much more that we have to do. First of all, we want to build these systems such that they generalize across different brain disorders. I've shown you mood disorders, depression, anxiety, but there are other disorders. We have chronic pain. We have obsessive compulsive disorder. We have PTSD. We have addiction. These are all mental health conditions. Beyond that, we have neurological disorders and movement disorders, let's say, leading to paralysis. So for example, in the case of paralysis, what we want to do is we want to actually decode somebody's movement intention. So if somebody's paralyzed, they can still think about moving their arm. The problem is they can't communicate that to their muscle. So what if we record brain activity, from that decode what movement they want to perform, and then translate that, for example, into a robotic arm? So in this case, what we want to do is essentially take brain activity, decode the movement, translate that into the movement of prosthetic. So we want to build these systems that are generalizable. In the case of BCI's brain-computer interfaces for movement control, there's been a lot of work done in the past 20 years, unlike what I've shown you for mental disorders. But even there, we need a lot of improvement. So how do we move towards making these systems better and have them generalize across different conditions? So what we want to do in my lab is to tap into the power of AI. Develop novel AI architecture that can generalize, that can be robust, that can improve performance in diverse brain disorders. So what I'm going to do for the remainder of my talk to show you some of these directions that we've been performing and show you how much improvement we can get by bringing in these ideas into the neurotechnology domain. So first, all of the methods I've shown you thus far, even though I didn't spell it out explicitly, they were based on classical machine learning and linear models. So you may ask me why? Everything I've shown you. Linear models are very robust. They're very flexible. They can run in real time. They're great for designing closed-loop control systems. There is a reason we use them. They're flexible decoding capabilities, whether real time, whether offline, whether you even have missing neural samples. So like if you have a wireless BCI, you may lose some packets of neural data. You need to be robust to that, and linear models are like that. But they are not nonlinear. They don't capture as much complexity. Now, in parallel to this, there's been beautiful work on AI and deep learning models. And while they, of course, capture more complexity, they don't have flexible decoding capabilities. So the question we asked was, can we develop an AI architecture that can do both, capture complexity while being flexible? And indeed, that is what we did. We developed an architecture we call DeFi that does exactly that. Again, I'm not going to go, of course, into the mathematical details, but just to give you an intuition, the idea here is that we capture the nonlinearity, in a nonlinear shape or manifold. Let's say here this donut. So now you've captured the nonlinearity in the shape, and what we can do is we can describe how data moves on this nonlinear shape according to a linear model. And that is exactly how we can get the best of both worlds. We can capture some nonlinearity, yet still use the linearity to enable flexible inference. Okay, how does this work? So let's look at it for decoding of movement this time. So we took this data set and we applied define for decoding of movement from brain activity and compared it to linear models as well as previous deep learning models of brain data. So this is how define decodes movement. So this is 70% correlation between the decoded and true movement. This is what a linear model does. So you can see it does much worse. And this is what a prior deep learning method does. So you can see that regardless of how much missing brain samples you have, define can do better decoding of movements. Moreover, if you think about its robustness, meaning how robust is it to some of the neural samples being missed, it was much more robust than the alternative. So it's a great choice for neurotechnologies. So that's one example. The other challenge that we've been thinking about solving by, again, tapping into this power of deep learning and AI is the fact that the brain activity patterns that we record, unfortunately, don't just relate to the behavioral or mental state that we are interested in decoding or studying. So what do I exactly mean by that? Let's provide an example, a concrete one. Let's say you're recording some brain activity and you're measuring some behavior, in this case, arm movements. And there's some brain states that give rise to your neural activity. The issue is that not all of the brain states that give rise to brain activity relate to movements. For example, I'm moving my arm right now, but I'm also talking. I'm also maybe hungry or thirsty. Maybe I'm nervous. Maybe I'm stressed. All of those things are represented in my brain at the same time. So if I look at brain activity, it doesn't just relate to my movement. It has a mixed representation. How do I disentangle the elements in brain activity that relate to the movement, which is really what I'm interested in decoding or studying? So what we really want are those brain states that essentially are shared between the behavior, in this case movement, and neural data, essentially those green behaviorally relevant states. Now, prior methods, including what I've shown you up to this point, just model neural activity first in isolation. And what can happen is that they can give you this red states that, while of course exist in your brain data, they're not behaviorally relevant. So with this motivation, we developed a method called PSID that directly dissociates, disentangles, and gets these movement-related states among all of the states in the brain. And then we tested it again for decoding of movements in this data set that I've shown you with reach and grasp. So what we found was that PSID at every state dimension decoded the movement more accurately than the unsupervised methods and did so much more efficiently, meaning with a much smaller state dimension. For those who don't know what that just means with a simpler model, which is important for building robust technologies. And this held whether we looked at alternative linear or nonlinear models. So this shows you that by disentangling those activity patterns that relate to what you actually care about, you can better decode them and you can do so more efficiently. Now, this was great, but I haven't shown you how we incorporate then the effect of input. Remember, that's another challenge that we have to think about when we model this neural and behavioral data simultaneously. So in a recent work, we actually also incorporate the effect of input into our neural behavioral models for dissociation of patterns. This input, as I showed you, could be electrical stimulation, it could be optical stimulation, it could even be sensory input. For example, if I tell you, okay, reach towards this microphone, you're seeing that, so that's an input. So we've developed algorithms that can actually incorporate inputs, and we again tested it in various data sets. We've shown that if we incorporate the effect of input with our method, we can decode movement much more accurately again than the unsupervised methods that are out there, including what I showed you previously. And finally, we can use this as a tool for science to study how brains generate movement. So for example, one question that is very important in neuroscience is whether our brains across different individuals generate movements in the same way or differently. So how do we decide or plan a movement towards, let's say, a cup of coffee? We see where that cup of coffee is, think of that as input, then our brain comes up with a plan, our muscles go into action, and we reach for the coffee. So the question was, does the way the brain encodes this depend on whose brain it is? Does it depend on what task it is? If I'm doing reach and grasp, if I'm typing, does it matter? Does the brain patterns change? So we use this algorithm to look at that. We first found that if you don't take into account input and behavior and look at brain patterns in general, they of course differ. But when we looked at just the relevant components of their brain that was related to movement execution with our algorithm, what we found was a remarkably preserved pattern across their brain. You can see that this circle is at the same location. So this shows you that by taking into account the effect of input behavior and looking at those patterns that are engaged in a task, we can actually discover very preserved and common brain processes that give rise to movement. All right, so finally, on this direction, what we wanted to do was to make these neural behavioral models more flexible and more performant. In particular, we wanted to write this relationship between brain data and behavior, let's say movement, in a manner that captured nonlinearities. So we wanted to write this in terms of mapping, each of which could be nonlinear. So now, again, we tapped into the power of AI. We developed recurrent neural network models that actually can achieve this nonlinear modeling and dissociate behaviorally relevant and irrelevant components. We allowed these AI algorithms to have inputs. We allowed them to extend across diverse neural modalities, whether you're electrically measuring the brain, whether you're optically imaging the brain, whether you're acoustically imaging the brain. This architecture extends to all of that. We also allowed for diverse behaviors. I've shown you movement decoding, but I've also shown you mood decoding. But you may want to decode decision choices when a person is making decisions. So this architecture, we made it in a way that can generalize across decoding of all of these different behaviors and different neural modalities. So that's another example of how AI can come in and really make a huge impact. So again, we compared this. That's what we do. We have to compare different methodologies. We compared it across diverse data sets with arm movements, eye movements, cursor movements. And this AI method that I showed you, we call DPAT, outperformed the linear PSID method and other RNNs that were unsupervised, both in terms of decoding of movement and prediction of neural activity. Okay, so we, of course, have talked about paralysis. We've talked about mood disorders. What about all of the other disorders? Can this architecture extend to that? Because as I mentioned, we want a generalizable architecture. So first, we looked at mood, and indeed, even for decoding of mood, this AI architecture was more accurate than the original mood decoders that I showed you that we built back in 2018, showing again the power of AI. Finally, one major challenge that I think we should all think about is to go beyond using a single modality of brain activity at a time, but rather make our models multimodal. So what do I exactly mean by that? Let me show you some of the recording modalities that we currently use, just on the electrophysiology side. I've already shown you this guy. This is an ECOG grid that collects data from the surface of the brain. So this, if you think about it, is collecting data at a large spatial and temporal scale, like thousands of neurons at the same time are represented. But we can also implant electrodes in the brain that go inside the cortex. We call these microelectrodes. These microelectrodes both give you something we call local field potential that are, again, on the order of 1,000 neurons being measured. But they also can give you activity at the resolution of single cells, single neurons, what we call spikes or action potentials. And then in the extreme, you can just wear an EEG cap. That's like millions of neurons at the same time. So why do we have to pick and choose? If we can record it at the same time, can we allow our models and technologies to go multimodal and multi-scale and essentially enable sensor fusion for the brain? So this was something that we've been working on. Actually, we have a lot of work, so I'm not going to go into this, but I'll show you one example of that. So in this paper, we actually looked at using single neuron activity, spiking activity, in addition to local field potentials at the same time for decoding. So why is this hard? If you look at these signals, these are spikes, these are field potentials. You can see that these are essentially 0, 1 time series. Again, for those who are technically inclined, this you can think of as a Poisson process. This is a continuous signal, has much slower time scale. So the question is, how do we build a model that can tell us how a given brain state is represented in both of them? So we've developed these models to enable sensor fusion for the brain. And we've shown in these data sets that if we use both of the modalities at the same time, we can decode this movement. I've shown you a joint angle in gray. This is decoding with one modality. You can see it doesn't track very well. But when I put the other modality on top, you can see I'm tracking it much better. So we can actually improve performance through this multimodal fusion. And the eventual vision is to go beyond just multiple modalities of electrophysiology, meaning just electrical activity that we record, and go to other modalities. For example, you may be optically measuring the brain, magnetically measuring it, acoustically measuring it. You may also have wearable data. I mean, these are also measurements of your internal states, your heart rate variability, as you have, for example, you're anxious, your stress, your cortisol levels change, your heart rate changes, maybe your pupil diameter changes. So why don't we build models that can aggregate information across all of these modalities to get a more accurate and robust tracking of mental states? That's where we're going. On the stimulation side, I've shown you electrical stimulation, but we can stimulate the brain with other modalities too, optogenetically, magnetically, even using focused ultrasound, right? So we are interested in building our systems to be multimodal such that they can extend across modalities. And this is particularly important for getting these to be more robust and accurate. So what is the final vision when we do all of this? We will build an AI system that can extract different mental states from human brain networks, but goes beyond that. It can regulate them in disease such that we can help those tens of millions of patients that are currently treatment resistant. And of course, if we have this multimodal AI systems, what we can do is we can integrate it with a lot of hardware devices. So if we build these AI systems to be multimodal, precise and accurate, I'm hoping that we can actually have it plug and play into these devices so that regardless of the modality of treatment and measurement, we can have it applicable and help these patients. So with that, I would like to conclude. As I've shown you, brain disorders are a leading cause of disability worldwide. We're working at the interface of AI, control theory, and neuroscience to develop next-generation neurotechnologies for modeling, decoding, and control on brain activity patterns to come up with alternative and potentially transformative therapies for tens of millions of people who really need it and improve their quality of life. So with that, I would like to thank my students and postdocs. They do all the work. I just get to come here and have fun with you guys, and all of the funding sources. And again, it's really, truly an honor to be the inaugural speaker of this series in memory of Christina. So thank you very much, especially to the Khademi family.